My name's Tim Winkler from Future Campus, and following the release of QS rankings this week, we wanted to take a look at what rankings really mean for the sector. Professor Cameron Neylon from Curtin's Open Knowledge Initiative has joined us. Rankings are out this week. A number of institutions are celebrating a rise in the rankings, and there's headlines across the country about that. Now, are we doing the right thing to base the narrative of our universities around rankings like QS?
Everyone loves a good news story, so they're going to go out with that. I was pretty disappointed to see that was the big university news story I've seen in media around Australia this month. There are more important things happening. I think these international rankings are a very narrow perspective and a very biased perspective on what makes a good university. And I do genuinely think that it's strategically poor planning to put them at the centre of your thinking about what an institution should be doing. Now, institutions gone up. One of the reasons for that is that the actual analytics for this year's QS has changed. And that's changed in ways that tended to favour Australian universities. Traditionally in rankings, Australian universities do okay on some of these numbers, on research performance in particular, but struggle to have the kind of visibility that's really important, particularly for the QS and Times Higher rankings. The shift towards issues of sustainability, where Australian universities don't do too badly in many ways, and also collaboration, particularly international collaboration, has tended to push those universities up the ranking. And you can see that because pretty much across the board. Challenge with that is, of course, next year, probably going to be dropping back down. There's only one way to go in a ranking, which is the other problem with them, right? So it's a zero-sum game. So everyone might have improved their performance, but only one person can go up and one person has to go down. So really poor tools for making important decisions.
Now, you said the rankings are a relatively narrow basket of a narrow window that they're looking at. What are how can we get a better system, and what are some of the factors that are keeping that narrow in its perspective?
Well, I think so. There's a couple of things that create a narrow perspective. One is that if you're looking across global settings, it's difficult to get any sort of consistent data. We are limited in the kind of data that's available to us. So, for instance, if you were looking at whether institutions were doing well on demographic diversity amongst staff or students, that information is very inconsistent from country to country. So that would always be a challenge in one of these global rankings, but it's also something that can be looked at at a national context. That's something that we do. But also, even within those traditional metrics, they're very, in my view, very old-fashioned kind of metrics. So, for instance, a lot of the research performance is based on the count of citations, which is all very well, but isn't it actually more interesting to look at the diversity of where those citations are coming from? If it's just the same person citing you over and over again, that's just people patting each other on the back. But if you're actually reaching a wider number of people, that would be a more interesting exercise. So I think there's narrowness in the indicators and metrics that are being used, and then narrowness in the set of things that are being tried to track. And the big questions around, what are universities for in society? What's our level of public engagement? How many members of the public are coming on campus or coming on campus in a digital sense to engage in the work we do or to tell us what work we should be doing? Those are things that are really missing. And are things that some Australian universities do pretty well.
So have you started to track them at Koki?
So it's hard for the traditional players. It's also hard for us. We've been looking very closely at measures that look at diversity. So both in terms of people and places and in terms of sort of traditional metrics, converting those into diversity measures rather than simple counts like the citation measures that I mentioned. We're trying to understand ways in which we might look at things like public engagement. So we've used a couple of different things in some work we did a few years back. We used some tools that other people put together. One was called the Walk Score, which really looked at combination of things like the level of public transport that was available on campus, connectivity to other urban settings. The problem with those is that they're not really suitable for an Australian setting because we found them pretty biased against the rural universities in particular. So there's a real need to think in the local context around how you track these things practically, and that's a big piece of work, but it's work where we're tackling, and other people are tackling as well. There's a lot of interest in this, particularly in the European setting where there are big shifts in terms of what people are looking at in terms of research evaluation.
So looking at Europe and the work that you've been doing with UNESCO and Europe and with the US, is there a different approach worldwide to the use of rankings in terms of shaping where institutions go?
Well, I think so. Australia for the last 20 years or so has been very focused on rankings, particularly rankings as a driver of international student numbers. In Europe and in the US, that the kind of obsessive focus on rankings, and in particular the big four, if you like, Times Higher, Leiden, QS and ARWU, has always been much less. I mean, they're used, they're important, but they've not got the same kind of laser focus. So there's always been less of that, but they've been influential. But over the last 5 years, there's been a really significant shift, led firstly by advocates for reform, particularly around the whole open science agenda. So that's something that's really driving the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation. That's a global movement, not just to making the formal results of research public, but to actually drive more engagement with research more generally, to make that more inclusive, both within the professional academy and beyond it. So things like citizen science and public understanding of science and all those kinds of things. So that shift's been happening particularly in Europe for a while now. Things like the Leiden Manifesto focused on reform of research evaluation, but most recently the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, which is now a coalition of over 500, at last count, it might be over 600 now, European organisations. And I'm not talking about marginal organisations, we're talking about the big European universities. And that's really quite radical for an Australian context. It's about moving away from quantitative towards qualitative, towards making sure everything is transparent and replicable in evaluation from top to bottom where quantitative indicators are being used, and very definitely a move away from rankings as a means for making important judgments about institutions.
So do we risk being left behind a little if Europe is moving in this way? What about the rest of the world? Are they also moving in that direction?
I think it varies a lot. So in terms of this sort of what would be perceived from Australia as a pretty radical shift away from traditional data providers, away from traditional approaches, again, towards this more sort of contextual qualitative stuff. Europe's very definitely leading there. There are definitely things happening in North America, but I guess the politics of how the systems work in North America is they're much more at the institutional level. Europe is much more centralized. There's much more cohesion and community movement on that. There are big movements occurring in Latin America. And so there's some very interesting stuff happening there, though at the same time, you have something that's similar to the Australian context, which is this kind of almost cultural cringe that we want to be seen as performing in the ways we think that the big players perform. But of course, when we do that, we look backwards. We look at what that looked like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Whereas today, I think those things have shifted a long way. And you see that in things like the take-up of open access, in terms of things like data sharing, but also in things like entire national evaluation systems that are explicitly moving away from quantitative indicators and measures and much more towards prospective and qualitative statements about what does success look like for my institution and how would I want to be judged 5 years down the track if we were successful in what we were achieving against our mission.
Now, this sounds, it is a really important conversation right at this moment when Australia is looking down the barrel of the Accord discussion. We've got ERA up in the air. People will say this sounds great, but at the same time, rankings are what we have. So why deviate from that?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of the familiar, and obviously with the ERA, at least for the moment, going away, there's a pretty big vacuum there in terms of the information that universities expected to have, and it had invested an awful lot of money in across the sector. So I think in our work, we've always recognised that while we would like rankings to just go away and disappear, that's not a realistic prospect. We have to make changes that are practical and credible and reasonable. But at the same time, I would also point to the fact like we're celebrating Australian universities went up, not because their performance necessarily improved, but because someone who didn't ask us about it changed the rules and changed the way the calculation was done. So actually, what do you have to compare against for last year? Except for what's really at this point kind of some random noise because of a change in the process. I mean, the biggest change we saw when we looked at the rankings over time a few years back, we discovered that one of the biggest changes in the relative positions within the rankings for the Times Higher ranking was when they shifted data sources from Web of Science to Scopus. And again, these things are not, these people are not accountable to us as a sector, as a country. So yes, they're what we have. They provide this international yardstick, which I get is familiar. And it's important to be able to tell that story, to government and say, it's a good news story, right? That's where we started. You don't throw away a good news story just because it's maybe not 100% absolutely defensible. But we also have to take control of this process. And ERA, love it or hate it, ERA was at least something that was within the Australian sector and system we had some say in. And I think it's really important to have a conversation about what comes next, because otherwise we're just at the mercy of these foreign media corporations and indeed the big four consultancies that process that data and feed us back to us. And a little bit more accountability and transparency might be appropriate in the space.
So just to finish up, imagine you're Jason Clare, you've got the keys to the higher education system, you're about to put the Accord on the table, and you really want to know, well, how are we going to measure success? What are you going to do? Are you going to throw out the ranking systems, or are you going to start to think about how do I quickly start to set us in the right direction?
I think the big challenge for the minister right at the moment is not having the ERA results that would have been there. And again, love them or loathe them. They represent a huge investment of effort, but at least that would have been a comprehensive and comparable view of the research sector and how it's been doing and how it's changing over time. So yeah, if I were in that seat, I'd be looking for that kind of something to help give that perspective and landscape view as a whole. And maybe that does involve looking at and passing out what information we can tell from these international rankings, but also looking at the other data we have at our fingertips. And then I think looking forward, it's a question of what's the strategy for ensuring that we have the information. Now, the Shields review really recommended this focus on disciplinary elements at a sort of rolling cycle of more focused assessments as a way of doing things with lower burden. And that makes sense. I would argue that on the flip side, we have the data capacities and data capabilities to actually do landscape analyses. And saying that, we obviously have built some of these things ourselves in our team. So conflict of interest, but nonetheless, I think there's the capacity to think about doing that at scale in a low burden way that complements the kind of deep dive focused assessments that are also really necessary and really important, and for which, you know, the ARC has a team that they're very good at doing that, and it's good sort of arm's length from any of the people in the sector.